Hi, Dr. P here to briefly talk about horses in warfare. What brought this topic to mind was watching an otherwise excellent history video on YouTube about the Ur-3 empire in Sumeria, which is around 2000 BC. And that was very long before horses played any part in warfare because they were too small. But the person who created the video was showing reliefs and sculptures that included chariots and cavalry. And that's just not appropriate. So I decided to do this brief discussion. Horses were originally domesticated on the steppes as food animals. They were much too small to be riding animals, so they played no part in warfare other than as food, mobile food. In the future, horses played the primary part in the shock action of chariots and cavalry, and also in missile-armed harassment chariots and the steppe peoples with their bows. So horses ultimately provided shock and mobility, but they haven't always been part of warfare, or even civilized warfare. Gradually, breeding made horses larger until they could, in a team, pull a slow cart with solid wheels, very heavy wheels, and later they could pull a fast, light, spoked wheel chariot. The spoked wheels were much lighter than the solid wheels and made things much more practical. At some point, and dates are disputed, maybe around 1500 BC, chariots, which were invented long before that time, north of the Caspian Sea or in the Ukraine, came to dominate warfare in the Near East. For example, we have the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC, which involved over 5,000 chariots. A chariot typically had 2 horses, although later some had 4. 2 men, a driver and an archer or some other missile person, and rarely a melee person. Some might have both an archer and a melee person along with the driver, and then the melee person was there for defense. Before the Han Dynasty, which dates back to about 202 BC, the power of the Chinese warring states was often measured by the number of chariots they were known to have. And this is a quote from Wikipedia: a country of 1,000 chariots ranked as a medium country, and a country of 10,000 chariots ranked as a huge and powerful country. Given the extra height and visibility from a chariot, they could be good command posts, and they remained in specialized use long after cavalry took over. Around 900 BC, horses became large enough for the smaller people of those days to ride into battle consistently. They probably wouldn't be big enough for contemporaries, and certainly not somebody like me who's 6'7", but they were big enough for the people of that time, and cavalry gradually replaced chariots in warfare. Now, chariots were still used for ceremony and entertainment, as in chariot racing, even in Roman times, but the Romans didn't use them in warfare. Cavalry was more agile and ultimately more efficient than chariots, and much cheaper. Now keep in mind, cavalry was rarely the decisive arm until the later Middle Ages, decisive arm in battles. Typically, the cavalry on the wings fought their battles against enemy cavalry, while the infantry in the center fought theirs against the enemy infantry. The exception that comes to my mind is that Hannibal made cavalry a decisive arm, because his cavalry was usually better than the Roman cavalry, and they were disciplined enough that rather than chasing the Roman cavalry and not playing a further part in the battle, they came back and attacked the Roman infantry from behind. Hannibal lost his last battle against the Romans in Africa because his best cavalry, the Numidians, had changed sides. So in that battle against Scipio Africanus, the Roman cavalry prevailed and then came back and attacked the Carthaginian infantry. Now, keep also in mind that stirrups were unknown in the ancient world. Even without stirrups, the cataphract or armored horseman could be formidable. For example, the Sarmatians, who were essentially steppe people. But if you're on a horse and you've got a lance, you're pretty scary to a guy who's on foot, even if you don't have armor. Horse archers were a specialized use of cavalry from the steppes, which was adopted by some people like the Byzantines. Knights dominated in the late Middle Ages, but there the English longbow and the crossbow started the decline of the knight. The difference being that the English longbow could be fired very rapidly, whereas a crossbow could only be fired slowly. Pikemen, who were using very long spears in a tight formation, something like a phalanx, ultimately dethroned armored knights. And of course, the firearm did in both heavily armored horse and the pikemen, as firearms became better. Of course, armored horsemen were always expensive. The knights usually had their own land to support their time as training and armor and so forth. In the Napoleonic times, despite the glittering horse units that they had, the decisive arm was artillery followed by infantry. Infantry bayonets were something horses weren't stupid enough to charge into. So infantry squares, faced with cavalry swarming all around, could maintain their defense. And cavalry in the age of firepower became raiders and scouts more than direct attackers. They lacked a lot of firepower, and also it's a lot easier when you're shooting at the enemy to hit them if they're on a big horse rather than just on foot. Now there's always a question where horses are involved. Do you ride horses into the battle itself, or ride there but then fight on foot? Viking raiders typically set up a camp, gathered horses from the local area to improve their mobility, and used those horses when they had to move away from the rivers. Harold Godwinson went up to Stamford Bridge and defeated the Norwegians, and then he came back on horses to fight on foot at Hastings. Now the Normans were different because they fought from horseback as cavalry. Much later, riding to battle and fighting on foot was called dragoons, or mounted infantry, though later yet the word dragoons was sometimes applied to people who fought from horseback. Horses have always provided transportation as long as they were large enough to pull carts and to carry a load. Even though horses did not like being on ships, which would be a problem for transportation. Now, some cavalry fought early in World War I, occasionally effectively, but usually not, and even in World War II. As late as World War II, horses were still a major transportation method for supplies, if not transporting people. And of course, when I say horses here, I also mean mules and donkeys. A great deal more could be said about this topic, of course. I'm sure a book could be written about horses in warfare, and probably has been, although I'm not aware of one. Thanks for listening.